Hi everyone, welcome back. This is our next lecture in our inequality unit, and today we're going to be thinking specifically about gender and sexuality, how we can think about them as social categories, and then what forms of inequality exist within them to this day, and sort of what creates that inequality. So in the first part of today's lecture, we're going to start off with a pretty simple question to guide this discussion, which is, what is gender, right? When we talk about this term, what exactly do we mean by it? So we're going to think about a couple guiding questions today, right? So as I'm saying, we're going to start with the simple question, what do we mean when we say sex, right? And what do we mean when we say gender, and how are those two things different? We often kind of use those words interchangeably and maybe get them a little mixed up at times. So today we're going to tease them out and talk about what each of them is and what we mean when we say those. We're going to talk about what are the social bases of gender, sort of how are all of these social forces we've been talking about underlying the concept of gender and how they construct gender, okay? And then, of course, we'll also talk about what kinds of gender inequality still persist today and then why they still persist. Sorry, I had to pause because my cat Milo decided to join us. Okay, say hi, Milo. All right, thought I'd give you guys a peek at what life here is like. Cats running around, all that. Okay. All right, so let's start with the first question, which is defining sex and gender, what each of them is and how they're different from each other. So when we talk about sex, which we talk about frequently, right? When you think about you go to a doctor's office and you need to check off your sex, for example, we're talking about some sort of category that is socially created, right? And in our third part, in one of the later parts of today's lecture, we are going to talk more about how sex is socially constructed. But essentially, when we say sex, we're talking about biological and physiological sex characteristics, right? So these are things like our genitals, hormones, our body composition, things that we associate with being either male or female, okay? And so when we talk about sex, we are using those terms male and female, right? They're a little bit more scientific sounding. They're in reference to our body, right? These physiological and biological components that, quote unquote, differentiate the male sex and the female sex. Furthermore, right, we talk about sex in regard to humans. We also talk about sex in regard to animals, even plants, right? So it's kind of like this universal category we use for living things. It's okay, Milo. All right. This is a little bit different than gender, right? Which we also talk about fairly frequently nowadays, and I think is kind of more in the social consciousness of our society, right? Whereas sex is kind of founded on those physiological differences, gender alludes more to cultural differences between categories, right? So gender essentially is cultural expectations for men and for women that are founded on biological differences, right? So what essentially does that mean? What this means, right, is that as a person in our society, right, we look at someone and we first perceive them to be male or female, right? We might see breasts, we might see their height, facial hair, things that we associate with different sexual categories. And from that, we derive some sort of cultural expectation for that person, okay? Whether they present masculine, for example, versus feminine, okay? The terms masculine and feminine don't refer to anything biological or physiological. They refer to, for example, how we expect men and women to dress, or what their voice inflection is going to sound like, or what language they use, how long is their hair, right? We associate really long hair with being very feminine and very short hair as being masculine, right? And that has nothing to do with the physiological characteristic of the hair itself, right? But just sort of the cultural expectations that we as a society have for how bodies should look and people should present themselves as men or women, okay? When we talk about gender, we're also talking about a sense of self, right? That you either feel like a woman or feel like a man, right? and whether you perceive yourself fitting neatly into those categories, right? Versus sex, you're born, the doctor says it's a boy, it's a girl, based on, primarily in those cases, genitalia, right? Though we could also talk about, when the baby's in utero, taking blood tests, testing hormones, things like that. Those are also indicators. Okay, so for this next part of the lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about the social forces that create gender, right? So there is this sort of popular myth that gender is an innate part of us, right? That we are born and that our sense of gender is inherent within us, right? And that it is personal and it is ours. And the truth is, right, unsurprisingly, because we're in a sociology course, right, that gender is socially constructed. So today, we're going to show that gender is, one, a social phenomenon, something that's socially created, all right? And then we're going to look at how specifically it's created at 3 different levels, right? So how gender is constructed at the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level, okay? And then later on, we're going to talk about how as we construct gender at each of those levels, we also produce inequality. I'm sorry if you can hear, there's a lot of construction going on outside, so hopefully you guys aren't getting too much of that. All right, so let's start at the micro, right? The smallest unit of society, and let's think about how gender is constructed through there. So remember, when we talk about the micro, we're talking about a sense of self and identity, right? So when we think about identity, that brings us back to this concept of socialization that we've already talked about in this class, okay? We know that socialization starts at a very young age before we're even conscious of it, right? And it happens in very explicit ways and also implicit ways. We also talked about that part of socialization is learning our place within society, right? Our own position. And we've talked about that this is classed and raced, right? We learn what our race is, for example, and what meaning that has in our particular society. This is also gendered, right? That as a young kid, we become aware of what our gender is because of what people are teaching us about gender, and how we should behave, right? How we should embody being a boy or a girl and what's expected from us. So here's some examples of how socialization might construct our gender identity, right? So at a very basic level, right, we're taught gender categories. As many of you probably already know, right, depending on your cultural context, there are lots of different gender categories we could look at, right? Not everyone has the same number or same kinds of gender categories. Moreover, even in America, you might be born in a household that only recognizes men and women or boys and girls as the 2 gender categories, right? You might have grown up alternatively in a household that recognizes many, many different kinds of gender categories. For example, I think Facebook right now offers over 40 different kinds of gender categories for users to choose from when creating their profile, right? So on a very basic level, right, when we're young, we're socialized to learn what kinds of gender categories we recognize in society, okay? We're also taught how to present ourselves in a gendered manner, right? So we're taught about clothes, we're taught about our hair, right? Should you, as a young girl, be wearing pretty dresses? As a boy, should you be wearing shirts with trucks on them or dinosaurs, right? We also learn about roles in the household, right? So as a child, you watch your parents be parents, right? And be partners. And you might learn, for example, that there is a very gendered division within the household where the mom always cooks and takes care of the kids and the dad goes to work and maybe takes care of money, right? Or maybe you didn't grow up in such a strictly divided household like that. But you're picking up on cues about what your future role is going to look like as either a boy or a girl. Your parents might even buy you, for example, play kitchen sets, right, where you pretend to cook or maybe to feed children, or you play imaginary games where you're the mom and your brother is maybe the dad. Okay, so we're picking up on these cues, right, and we're internalizing what our gender means and what we can expect from our gender as we grow up. Moreover, the kinds of activities our parents put us in, right, tells us something about our gender. Did your parents let you play soccer, or did they let you do ballet, right? Or did you grow up in a household where all of your siblings were playing soccer or hockey or ballet, regardless of their gender? Okay, so all of these cues we take in, right? And as we're being socialized into the broader society, we're also learning what that society thinks about gender, right? And then how we are gendered as well and what that means for other people. Right, so then let's move up a level and we'll think about gender at the meso level. So the meso, if you guys recall, involves all things interactional, right? So we're thinking not just about social identity here, but people in interaction with other people or even small groups of people, right? So when we think about gender at the meso level, we're starting to think about how our gender is constructed alongside other people in interaction, okay? So what we see here, right, is that gender is sort of like an action or a process, not so much just a property within us, okay? And so what does that mean? I'll explain that a little bit more. When we interact with people, right, we come to realize that they expect certain things from us, and that many of those things are gendered, right? So, for example, if you're a teenager and you're starting to date, right, you might get an impression from other people what your date expects from you, right? Do they expect you to pay for dinner? Do they expect you to dress a certain way, right? Are you expected to present very feminine, to do your hair, to do your makeup? Are you expected to perform your sexuality in some way, okay? Moreover, this is clear when we think about like small kids on a playground, right? When they're first starting to learn about gender, how even small children reinforce gender in some way with one another, where as a girl, you might be made fun of for being a tomboy, for example, or if you're a boy, you might be made fun of for crying, right? So when interacting with other people, they're reinforcing these gendered expectations that you are learning in other places, okay? The other thing that's really kind of interesting about gendered interactions, right, is that by interacting with other people, we're able to perform our gender and express those gendered expectations alongside other people. Okay. So this brings us into the reading for today, which is Weston Zimmerman's very famous article, Doing Gender, right? So if you study gender and sociology, this is a must read. You will read this lots and lots and lots. It's kind of just a really fundamental piece of work that we still talk about today. So Weston Zimmerman, essentially their main argument is that we as people are not born with a gender, right? And again, go back to that difference between sex and gender in your brain. They say, like, we're born with sex, we're not born with gender, meaning we're not born with those cultural expectations. So just because we're born with a vulva or a penis doesn't mean that we're also born knowing what those mean for society, right? What cultural meaning that carries. So they say we're not born with gender, and gender is an unstable category, right? And this should sound kind of familiar to our conversation about race, okay? So meaning that gender changes over time, what gender means. The gender categories we have changes over time as well. It's not consistent or stable. So they argue that if we're not born with gender, then what is gender? And they say that essentially gender is a performance, right? And again, we might even think back to Irving Goffman and symbolic interactionism when we hear this, right? They argue that gender is something that we routinely accomplish, okay, through everyday interactions with other people. All right, so what does this mean? I think going back to examples is helpful here, right? So for example, if we are someone who is trying to portray ourselves as masculine, right? We identify as a boy, that is the gender that has meaning for us, and that is something that we want to convey to other people. We have to routinely try and do that, right? It's not like something we check off and then we go about our daily lives. We need to, for example, present our clothing in a masculine way. We need to know what the rules of interaction with other people are if we're masculine. We need to know what dating rituals look like with other people if we want to appear masculine. Okay, so it's something that we're continually striving to convey to other people, right? That we are a boy and we are masculine. Same thing for femininity, right? We're going to try and do our hair in a feminine way, our makeup in a feminine way. We're going to have a certain voice inflection that sounds feminine with other people. Okay. Moreover, this is really clear when people fail to meet those gendered expectations, right? When, for example, I keep coming back to dating for examples, but I think they're really illuminating because it shows like a highly gendered process, right? If you, for example, are going to the grocery store quick and you put your hair up in a bun and you put on a pair of sweatpants and an old baggy t-shirt and you like don't look your best, right? Or your cutest, and you run into your crush at the grocery store, how deeply embarrassing that might be for you because you are not at your peak of femininity, right? You're not actually successfully conveying the culturally agreed upon feminine sort of appearance, right? And that is a failed attempt at doing gender in that case. Okay. So sort of circling back, we sort of zoomed in to look at the examples. Let's zoom out again and look at the big picture, right? So to reiterate, West and Zimmerman are arguing that gender is not an innate part of us that we embody and we just kind of check off and go about our daily business, but gender is something that is routinely achieved and has to be enacted every day of our lives to convey to other people that we are feminine or masculine. Okay, so this is something that happens every day. Okay, so just to wrap up, I have this quote here from the article that I think kind of summarizes this point well. They say, gender is a managed property of conduct that are contrived with respect to the fact that others will judge and respond to us in particular ways. We have claimed that a person's gender is not simply an aspect of what one is, but what one does, and does recurrently in interaction with others. Okay, so gender is not something that we are, it's not an identity, it's an action, something that we have to do every single day to conform to others' expectations of what masculinity or femininity means. Right. And then finally, let's bump up to the final level, right, and look at gender at the macro. So again, when we're thinking about the macro level, we're thinking structures, organizations, networks, sort of big picture stuff. So when we think about gender at the macro level, one way to think about this is cultural expectations, right? That's sort of big level, what are big cultural norms that are guiding our actions or cultural expectations. So we can think about one, right, what guides parents to socialize their children in a certain way? So we talked about socialization and how that socialization process cues us into what gender is and what our gender means. But then we can also think about what are those big cultural norms that lead parents to socialize their children in a certain way. Okay, so that's one way of thinking about it. For example, we could think about the media, right? What common discourses about gender do we see in the media that would maybe influence how gender socialization takes place? I think maybe what's more interesting is we could look at how gender happens at the structural level. Okay, so again, structure, we're talking about a system of opportunities and constraints for people depending on your positionality. Okay. So we might think about, for example, laws or regulations that reinforce gender categories. Okay, legally, is your gender recognized, or are only two gender categories recognized? How does that change over time? How does that change cross-culturally? My cat's getting mad. I don't know if you can hear him meowing. So we might think about Title IX, for example, as a regulation that defines gender in some way, or what gender equality looks like in this case, right? We could think about the Equal Pay Act, right, that also outlines what the relationship between men and women looks like. We can also look at census categories, right, the fact that they define gender as male or female and don't give opportunity for people to define themselves in other ways. I also have here sort of a screenshot of an article written at Rutgers, right, about the MVC opting or offering people the option to change their gender identification on licenses, right? This is an example of a structural change in which people now have the opportunity to legally conform to the gender that they feel is appropriate for them, right? Okay, so what does all of this tell us then? That gender is constructed at the micro, the meso, and the macro through socialization and identity and interaction, and then also through structure. So what this is indicating to us that's really important is that gender is a social product, right? It doesn't exist outside of the social environment. It's created through the social environment, and it's given meaning through all of these different kinds of social processes, okay? This also shows us that gender is constructed at many different levels, right, at these 3 different levels, which means that, one, it's very strong and it's very durable. Okay, so the reason people have so many feelings and opinions about gender is because it is really kind of present in every aspect of our lives, and so it feels very real to us. It doesn't feel socially constructed often because of how omnipresent it is and how kind of long-lasting and durable it is because it's constructed at all of these different levels. Okay, so, lost my place. So we as sociologists should think about gender as something that's unstable and constantly fluctuating and kind of arbitrary in a sense because it is social, but it is felt as something that's very strong and durable because it's constructed through all of these different means, so it's very present in our society. Okay, so that's going to wrap up part 1. In part 2, we're going to start thinking about how gender inequality is also constructed at each of these 3 levels, and what gender inequality looks like still today.